My esteemed friends, welcome to my channel. I am Alexander Musienko. It's May 26th, Monday, and on this day I bring you my traditional briefing about the events that I consider relevant, important, and worthy of your esteemed attention. I apologize for my voice, but frequent changes in temperature, let's put it that way, and being in various places, including sometimes in shelters, have led to these consequences. But that's not the main thing right now. What's important are the news and events that are happening. So, Russia continues its missile and drone terror. That is, last night as well. I'm talking about the period during which I'm addressing you. On the night of May 25th to 26th, Russia launched a significant number of Shaheds across Ukrainian territory. I think that soon we will see the exact statistics from the Air Force of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, which will allow us to assess the number, the scale, and accordingly the number of Shaheds that were shot down or those that were suppressed by electronic warfare systems. In addition, Russia deployed Tu-95 aircraft, their strategic bombers, which took off from the Olenya airfield beyond the Arctic Circle and also took off from Engels and launched cruise missiles. The number is also currently being clarified and further investigated. Shaheds were also detected in the airspace, though not in all regions, but the danger is somewhat less than it was, for example, a few hours ago, because at least for now, no missiles are currently being detected. Nothing new is happening. The tactic of terror. Those who follow my channel probably remember that I talked about this and warned that Russia would bet on drones, that Russia would mass produce Shaheds in order to solve its objectives in this way. What objectives does the enemy have? Well, first, it's the demoralization of the Ukrainian people. Second, an attempt to break the resistance. Third, to demonstrate some of their capabilities and strength. Fourth, to test the West's reaction, to see how far Putin can allow himself to go. And in this regard, there is already a reaction from Biden, slip of the tongue. There is a reaction from Donald Trump, the President of the United States of America, and he wrote, as usual, on Truth Social, his social network. We'll look at that a bit later. And another goal is the attempt to wage a war of attrition, to wear down our systems, to deplete our air defense reserves, and so on. By the way, over the past few days, I've seen discussions on social media referencing certain, sources somewhere, claiming that supposedly Ukraine might be lacking certain air defense systems, for example, for the NASAM systems, which are capable of countering cruise missiles and drones. The American-Norwegian system is truly a very good one, which has proven itself extremely well over time. And I am not really a supporter of bringing such sensitive information into the public domain. Obviously, yes, we understand perfectly well, objectively speaking, if you think about it, the more enemy attacks there are, combined of various types, of course, certain resources and means are expended. Although in the case of the Shaheds, it's not just about ammunition. Here we see other technologies at work. And, for example, what was published by the 412th Regiment of Unmanned Systems Forces. In my posts in the YouTube community, I shared relevant statistics where representatives of this regiment noted that there are already cases and evidence of them increasingly shooting down Shaheds with interceptor drones. This is a good sign. And this means that we are actually seeing an increase in capabilities and resources, as well as an expansion of the relevant area. This concerns what, how, and when we can shoot down enemy drones. So, in fact, the room for maneuver here is expanding. But when discussions go public about what we might soon be lacking, what we need, I don't think this is necessarily very constructive. The enemy reads this too, the enemy listens to it. I understand, perhaps, these people who want, by sharing information through Western media, to actually draw the attention of our Western partners and our Western political colleagues so that they respond and increase both funding and the supply of the systems themselves, as well as the interceptor missiles for them. But this may not always have a constructive effect. this, in the end, is something that also needs to be remembered. And these elements of terror are in many ways also connected to a sense of powerlessness directly on the battlefield. Again, analysts at JP Morgan have calculated, let me remind you, that it would take Russia 118 years to capture all of Ukraine at the current pace of their offensive. This was calculated by American analysts from the leading financial institution JP Morgan. And there were also calculations last year from the British General Staff stating that, for example, if Russia talks about capturing, say, Zaporizhzhia or Kherson, then right now they would need to concentrate about 2 million troops just in that direction. And this would take 3, 4, or possibly even 5 years, provided that attacks are carried out only in this direction with the necessary weapons and 2 million troops. Let me remind you that according to the statement made by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Oleksandr Syrsky, which he delivered on the 15th, during the 15th and 16th of May, when an informal summit of NATO foreign ministers was taking place in Turkey, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine spoke and stated that the current military presence on the territory, on the occupied lands of our country, as well as near Ukraine, the military presence of Russian troops amounts to 640,000. That is, by no means the 2 million that, according to British estimates, would be needed to talk about Kherson or Zaporizhzhia. And against this backdrop, Russia, Putin feels a certain sense of helplessness. He sees that, well, let's say, even those storm clouds that had gathered, and it seemed as if the position of the United States was changing due to Trump's understanding, due to a certain sympathy from Trump, which exists and which Putin sensed because Trump was constantly willing to postpone certain decisions and give the Russian dictator more and more and more time. Also because, unfortunately, the United States was putting pressure, including on Ukraine. So, in fact, Putin decided that a favorable situation was forming, one in which it was time to force Ukraine into capitulation, to force Ukraine to surrender. That is why, in fact, he began to employ a tactic of terror in order to, as he sees it, speed up these processes. But they are not speeding up because Ukraine is building relationships with its partners. And when it seemed from February 28th of this year, after we remember that meeting at the White House between President Zelensky of Ukraine, President Trump, and the arguments that took place there, and US Vice President J.D. Evans was present, and the journalist who asked that question behaved provocatively. But still, Ukraine managed to establish contacts, a strategic dialogue, and we can't say that we've broken ties with the United States. In addition, Ukraine continues to defend itself, repelling Russian attacks. Next, Russia has failed to capture Pokrovsky. Look, just last week the enemy was actively spreading information through its propaganda media that they had already entered the territory of Dnipropetrovsk region. Well, this fact is not confirmed. Yes, indeed, it must be acknowledged that Russian troops have achieved certain tactical successes. Yes, indeed, they are succeeding. Yes, they are suffering heavy losses, but despite everything, they are managing to advance in certain directions, create additional threats, and in some places try to wear down our defense force units. This, unfortunately, is a fact. In other words, the fighting is quite active and difficult. But as for breakthroughs on the operational strategic level, when we could talk about Kherson, about Zaporizhzhia, when we could speak of a significant large-scale advance of the enemy deep into Ukrainian territory, no, we are not seeing that. But of course, Russia will continue to attack. And the information that they have brought in, about 50,000 of their personnel from the territory of Belgorod region to the Kharkiv direction, to the Kupiansk direction, of course, also raises certain concerns because it likely indicates that by mid-autumn, Russia will be attacking more actively and aggressively at the front, trying at the very least to improve its tactical position compared to what it is now, at this particular moment in time, as of now. And then there is the terror. But how should we act and what should we do? Ukraine is responding. We can see that specifically when we talk about Shahids, it was restless last night in Tatarstan, in Yelabuga. I think many of you have already heard about this place. This is the city where Iranian-made kamikaze drones, the Shaheds, are produced, or as they are called in Russia, Geran-type drones. And it was quite restless there. Local public pages, resources, and in general enemy telegram channels and others are posting videos that supposedly show air defense activity, explosions, gunfire, and so on. This is very good, it's a positive sign. In addition, videos and photos of an explosion at a Russian military-industrial complex plant in the city of Tula were published. Of course, this is also something that cannot help but please us, because it is very good, positive signs. However, we must understand that we are engaged in a very serious arms race when it comes to drones. And not just drones themselves, but their types, their quality indicators, capabilities, performance characteristics, in other words, their flight range and payload capacity. What is no less important, and perhaps the most crucial, is the ability to bypass air defense systems, to avoid being hit by enemy air defense and electronic warfare means, and to deliver a significant amount of powerful explosives to the target in order to cause an explosion, fire, or destruction at the sites where these drones are directed. And here, of course, we are now moving forward, essentially in competition with our enemy, because we have to be better. Right now, The Economist has published an analytical piece noting that Russia is currently producing about 300 Shaheds every 3 days. In other words, essentially, what they launched over the territory of Ukraine in 3 days was produced in Russia over the course of 5 to 6 days. Accordingly, there are further statistics indicating that this number could double, meaning that 500 to 600 drones could be produced in just 2 to 3 days. Overall, Russia plans to reach a production rate of 300 to 400 drones per day. This is the target they aim to achieve, and in the future they intend to increase it to 1,000. And the authors of The Economist carefully note that in this particular way, Russia could potentially reach figures where, essentially, it would be able to launch almost 1,000 of the Iranian-made Shahed drones. These are unmanned aerial vehicles in a single massive strike. Undoubtedly, this poses certain challenges and threats. This needs to be taken into account. The Shaheds are changing, the Shaheds are altering their tactical characteristics, and with the help of the Russians, the Shaheds are increasingly integrating artificial intelligence technologies to improve their targeting and guidance systems in order to be more effective at bypassing our electronic warfare systems and finding corridors. So it's no longer a secret that they fly in this kind of cascade, depending on the territory they are flying over. They try to conduct reconnaissance, identify the locations of our air defense systems and possibly electronic warfare systems, and in this way they attempt to pass through these echelons as they see it with less risk to themselves. So these threats exist. And it seems to me that there is simply no other response here except to increase strikes on Russian territory and to improve the quality and effectiveness of our various types of UAVs. We have to strike, and moreover, we need to look for targets, including those located in cities, in large population centers where they are city-forming enterprises. Because under such circumstances, it will not just be a strike on a specific military-industrial complex facility in Russia, but rather a strike on certain city-forming enterprises, for example, which will pose even greater challenges and will also worsen, among other things, the socio-economic situation in certain regions. And the enemy must feel for themselves the full bitterness of the consequences of their own actions. I see no other way out here, so Russia must be bombed to the maximum. And now, it seems to me, the priority is to coordinate all our defense industrial complex resources precisely for these purposes. I think, dear friends, you will support me in this. If so, please share your thoughts in the comments. We need to set priorities in our sector and, based on the current type and nature of the war, make choices and focus on what we need right now, what is most effective, and what can somewhat improve our situation and shift the war onto the enemy's territory. Meanwhile, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, has already commented. Before that, there were reactions from Keith Kellogg, Trump's special representative on Ukraine issues. He wrote on X and called on Putin not to violate international law. Naive, of course, friends, very much so, as if such calls have ever stopped Putin from violating international law. Well, that clearly hasn't stopped a war criminal, and he also called for a ceasefire. Then Senator Bacon, also a prominent Republican senator, came out and called to arm Ukraine to the teeth and to impose devastating sanctions against Russia. And Donald Trump's personal spiritual advisor and good friend, Pastor Burns, who has notably visited Ukraine, also called to put pressure on Russia with sanctions and to stop what Putin is doing, calling it completely unacceptable. So, it is clear that within the Republican camp there are more and more voices saying that Putin must be punished, pressure must be put on Russia, and Ukraine should be armed to the teeth. What remains is to move from words to action, and for President Trump to actually start acting in this way. Because, for example, Reuters reports that Trump is seriously considering the possibility of introducing and strengthening anti-Russian sanctions. There are two questions here. Seriously considering, since when? This saga has actually been going on since mid-April probably. In terms of Trump possibly strengthening sanctions, we have already gone through many stages. When Russia fails to fulfill its obligations, when Russia carries out blatant terrorist attacks, when civilians in our cities are killed and suffer, and there is supposedly a reaction from the United States that Trump is about to make some decision, but in reality, this never actually happens. And the key point is, so how long is this going to be under consideration? How much more time is needed to understand the obvious things, for example, those mentioned by Italy's foreign minister Tajani, who says that, well, at the very least, the Russian-Ukrainian war will not end by the end of this year, and that Russia continues to conduct military operations. What is evident? That she doesn't give up on her goals. And obviously, the situation on the battlefield does not indicate that Putin wants to wind down this war. This is no secret to us. So now the next move is up to America. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, clearly emphasized in his address that the silence of the United States of America certainly does not help resolve the situation right now. On the contrary, it can only encourage Putin, encourage the aggressor. And Trump responded on the Truth Social network, writing that he is dissatisfied with what Putin is doing. He also said that he doesn't recognize him at all, because for some reason, in the US president's view, Putin was supposed to be different. But at the same time, well, he also called for all of this to stop. But he also reproached the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, saying that he supposedly also doesn't want to stop something, but without any conclusions. Well, we'll see what happens next. The pressure from the Republicans, among others, is increasing now. Let's wait for Europe's reaction. We're entering a new week. It was the weekend. We understand perfectly well, though, that war knows neither weekends nor vacations. This is something we need to remember. And already during this week, I think, and I expect and hope, that we will see not just serious statements, but also serious actions from our Western partners aimed at supporting Ukraine, just as the Netherlands is doing by delivering the next batch of much-needed F-16 aircraft to Ukraine. Not new ones, not the most modern. Unfortunately, that's the case. But they are needed, and they will fully perform their function. This is how other countries should act. Not just condemn, but every word must be followed by concrete steps in the form of military support and sweeping sanctions. By the way, this is what Ukrainians are waiting for. They are waiting for the world's response, because Putin cannot be allowed to act with impunity like this. And as for us, we have to do our part, produce more drones, improve their quality and quantity, and move forward. Over major cities and facilities, military sites within cities, in large numbers over Russian cities, over Moscow, more drones. That is what I wish for. Take care of yourselves and glory to Ukraine.